There he is. He's not that big. I just wanted to say at the start that for someone like me who's spent most of their life fixated on the 60s and the counterculture, it's a pleasure to be here. This is sort of hallowed ground, really. I think the Rolling Stones rehearsed in the Tabernacle at one point. The film performance is set just across the way on Powis Square. Pink Floyd cut their teeth around here. It also has a very indelible association with The Clash. All that is part of the reason why my most pleasurable phase of living in London was when I lived 5 minutes down the road, when I was a music journalist. That was a good 10 years before anyone had heard the word oligarch. Anyway, my 15 minutes will now commence. I'm going to try and tell you two stories, which you find woven together in the new book I've written, which is called Maybe I'm Amazed. One of those stories is about my son, James. James is now 18. The other is about music and the human mind. And it's not a story I would have even begun to think about, let alone write a book about, had I not been James's dad. James was born in 2006. I was a music writer for the most part at that point. I'd been completely obsessed with music since I was about 5 years old. Obsession is a part of this story which will occur with some regularity. But I decided that it was time for me to branch out into political writing. I was a fool. I used to get flown to Los Angeles to meet rock stars. And the next thing I knew, I was in Stoke-on-Trent asking people why they voted for Nigel Farage. So that was me. And James's mum, Ginny, had just stopped working as the head of press at Warner Brothers Records. We were a musical family from the get-go. Ginny and I both were first-time parents. And by the time James was around 2.5 years old, he was a seemingly happy, endlessly curious toddler. He'd started to walk and talk a little later than a lot of other kids, but the same would apply to me. I asked my mum that question. And our days sort of passed in that weightless, pleasurable way, which is common to most new parents. It was obvious from very early on that James loved music. When he listened to his favourite songs by the Beatles in particular, or Kraftwerk, who we'll come on to, it sent him into a sort of rapture. Now, some people here will probably remember the classic iPod, a small device about the size of a Twix that could hold tens of thousands of songs and which really revolutionized lots of people's relationship with music, including mine. That's a CD player there. That's what I got rid of because of the iPod. I bought an iPod not long after James was born. And when James was not much older than 2, with no input from me, he taught himself how to confidently operate my iPod. And as I watched him do it, I discovered something else. Most of the songs on the iPod came with images of the cover art. People will remember this, but some didn't. The cover art was missing. All there was text. And he could find his way to the songs that didn't have cover art with them just as easily as the ones that did. And that made me curious. Clearly, he was divining something in the text that was in front of him. So I wrote down one of his favorite song titles on a piece of paper. This is when he was barely more than 2. And I held it up and I said, "What's that, James?" And he said, "I Am the Walrus." And I wrote down another one. I said, "What's that, James?" And he said, "Autobahn." He was sight-reading words. That realization hit me like a hammer. He was also, by this point, able to memorize his favorite children's books from start to finish. And one afternoon, which I clearly remember, the iPod started playing the Beatles' Paperback Writer, and James fixed me with a very intense look, and he recited the whole song verbatim, something he started to do with more and more of the songs he loved. By this point, he was obsessed with a lot of the music that he found on my iPod. He has the rare accolade, James, distinction, I think, of being the only toddler in history who was obsessed with the 1970s British group Mott the Hoople. Now, all these things seem faintly magical to me and Ginny, but as I said a moment ago, I don't think, but I'll say it now, there were things about James that were beginning to nag at me slightly. People would sometimes say James was placid. That was the word they used. His use of language was kind of staccato. It was full of nouns. There weren't many verbs, and he very rarely asked questions. He had problems sometimes following an instruction, And at his nursery, he sometimes seemed to be almost indifferent to the other kids. There were also times when James found parts of his sensory experience completely overwhelming. Vacuum cleaners, police sirens, and barking dogs would send him into a state of panic. In some shops, supermarkets in particular, he'd fall to the ground and press his face on the floor as if he was trying to completely block everything out. When James was about to turn 3 and he'd just been joined by his sister, we moved house and he went to a new nursery where within about 3 sessions they said we should get him checked out, that was their words, and they mentioned autism. And that began a period of about 6 months, with his formal diagnosis of autism about halfway through. When most of the magical things I've been talking about, I don't think it had to be like this, but this is how it was. Those magical things were sort of pathologized, and we were constantly told by lots of experts and professionals about the things James couldn't do and would probably never be able to do. I remember this period pretty vividly. It was absolutely awful. A steady stream of people from the NHS and the local council visited our house, carrying tests and boxes of paraphernalia like building blocks and beads and coins that went in slots. And they would sit on the sofa with these forms and they would register lots of fails and no passes and pretend that wasn't what they were doing when I knew full well that's what they were doing. I suspect James probably did as well. And on it went. We went to see an NHS paediatrician who told me, these are priceless words, come back in a few years and then we'll really know what we're dealing with. And we, through all these encounters, acquired a lexicon of completely new words. James's facility with text and spelling, we discovered, was called hyperlexia. The way he could precisely recite songs or books was called echolalia. A lot of his daily rituals and obsessions, we were told, were defined as rigid and repetitive behavior. James flapped his hands when he was happy or excited, which we'd always thought was really cute. And we were told that was self-stimulatory behavior, or stimming, a very ugly word. What nobody told us was what we should do. I always say we didn't get so much as a pamphlet. The other thing they didn't tell us was about anything James might be good at. Now, I now want to fast forward 6 or 7 years, way beyond James looking like that. I think he's about 6 in that picture. So about 2 or 3 years later. By then, we understood that James's autism was quite intense. It was woven through with some learning disabilities, and we had to fight our local council to get the support in mainstream school James needed, to the point that I almost had a breakdown. I checked my privilege here because it was relatively easy for me. God knows what it's like if English isn't your first language or you're a single parent, but it was still absolutely awful. But anyway, by the time James was 9, the intense interest in music he'd had when he was little had completely blossomed. He obsessively loved the Beatles, Kraftwerk, and The Clash. It's a moment of absolute euphoria when he saw that in Liverpool, quite unexpectedly. I felt quite euphoric as well, I have to say. And every week, I would take him to keyboard lessons on the outskirts of Bristol, which is about an hour from where we live. I was sort of gone. It was 2 hours there and back, but it seemed like I was doing the Lord's work, so I did it. He quickly learned through those lessons to read and play music. And I eventually found out that James has absolute pitch, which for those of you who don't know, is the ability, if you hear a note, to say what it is, or to sing notes to order, or spot instantly what key a particular song is. Absolute pitch occurs among human beings as a whole at the rate of about 1 in 10,000. Among autistic people, it's reckoned to be 1 in 200. And it was self-evident to me that that ability had a lot to do with James's sensitivity to sound. Now, I'm not talking about genius-level skills here, but compared to all the negative, miserable stuff we'd sort of had dropped on us when James was diagnosed, this all felt revelatory. It was thrillingly different. And there was one watershed moment in particular, which is in the book. Eventually, when James was at middle school, we still have those in Somerset, along with horses and carts and what have you, his middle school put on a production in the form of a talent show. And with me on guitar, James insisted, quite rightly, that he played I'm Waiting for the Man by the Velvet Underground. He was 10, which is a song about desperately scoring heroin in Harlem. but no one seemed to mind. We got 2 standing ovations, and it was suddenly pretty clear that James didn't just love music, he was really, really into performing. And while all this was going on, I'd started to think about what James's life so far might tell me about music and musicians. I'd met a lot of those down the years in the course of my work as a music writer, so had his mum. Now, at this point, I ought to say something brief about autism and what it is. Autism is the word we have for a cluster of human traits that often coincide and that occur with varying degrees of intensity, hence the idea of a spectrum. Maybe not so much a straight line, but think of a constellation. That's one metaphor I've been told to use in the past. And autism basically describes differences to do with how people relate to other human beings, attachments to routines and rituals, and how people's senses work. Now, the woman who invented the idea of the autistic spectrum, the British psychiatrist Lorna Wing, once said a very interesting thing. She said, "Nature never draws a line without smudging it." Think about that. She also said, "I do believe you need autistic traits for real success in science and the arts, and I'm fascinated by the behaviors and personalities of musicians and scientists." Now, as James grew up and I learned more and more about autism, I began to understand that among many musicians, there is what psychologists and psychiatrists call a common cognitive style. That isn't a matter of anything as crass and crude as saying this or that person is or was autistic. The point is that autistic people are part of a bigger kind of neurological family, and there are lots and lots of musicians in it. When I thought back to all the time as a music writer that I'd spent hanging around bands, I straight away began to see something I hadn't seen at the time, but in retrospect, it was clear as day. Some of them, most of them, had had very brief careers, but others had been talented to a virtuosic extent and been artistically and commercially successful. Everyone I'm talking about had a seemingly instinctive mastery of their instrument and an ability to understand the workings of a recording studio and a fondness for hanging around in shops for hours at a time that looked like that. Some had amazing powers of musical recall, amazing musical memories. They sometimes seemed to hear things that other people just don't or can't. And they were obsessive very often to the point of practicing for hours at a time. None of those things clearly are easy to do. But running alongside those talents, there were things they obviously found difficult. In my experience, very often, they hated being interviewed, which made life a right laugh. They were rarely great conversationalists. Very often, these people were shy and solitudinous. In retrospect, they sometimes had difficulties with what psychologists call executive function, which is basically the ability to easily plot how you get from A to B to C. In fact, the more successful musicians I met had someone to do all that for them. They were called tour managers, and they were paid to knock on people's door every morning and say things like, "Dave, lobby in 20 minutes. And Dave would say, "Where are my shoes?" And they would say, "I will help you look for them." And then they would give them an itinerary of the rest of the tour and tell them what they were doing that day. Now, just to make one thing clear, I'm not trying to suggest that my 18-year-old son, who now loves playing Smith songs on the piano and is slowly and doggedly teaching himself the 6-string guitar, is an undiscovered virtuoso. There's just a cast of mind I see in him and I keep reading about in other people, and it can have ordinary and extraordinary manifestations. So to finish, here are a few of the more extraordinary examples of what I'm talking about. Mozart apparently couldn't stand unexpected loud sounds. He was said to be reckless in practical matters, to the point that even when he was an adult, his parents wouldn't allow him to travel alone. Brian Wilson, who, as you know, passed away very recently, could hum the entire Marine Corps hymn at the age of 11 months. He had absolute pitch, and he was also one of the most unforthcoming, awkward interviews I've ever spoken to. I interviewed him about 15 years ago, and the longest answer was 5 words long. I did nothing with the copy. What was it like working with Paul McCartney? It was great. I like Paul. Let's move on. John Coltrane, who I never interviewed, because he was dead by then, could practice the saxophone famously for up to 16 hours a day, and sometimes fell asleep with the reed of his instrument in his mouth. His wife, Alice, his second wife, said, "John didn't care for socializing, and I didn't care for socializing, so that's sort of the way it was." Van Morrison was once described as just incredibly shy and ill-prepared for social interaction of any kind. If you've ever been to see him in concert, you will have got that feeling. Prince was asked to contribute to We Are the World, the American song recorded for famine relief in Ethiopia, a much better song than Do They Know It's Christmas, which was recorded up the road. Prince said he couldn't come to that recording session, he couldn't participate, because, to quote one of his friends, there were too many people and he would feel uncomfortable. I think I now understand who those people were and why the demands of the music industry really didn't suit them. More than ever, I definitely understand who my son is and the kind of mind he has. And I realize something else, that what we now these days call neurodiversity, which is to say the plain fact that lots of human minds work in complex ways outside any kind of norm. Without neurodiversity, there wouldn't be nearly as much brilliant music for me and for James to listen to. Thank you for listening to me.